Well, our focus over the next couple of days will be on the former princely states of southern India, and in particular the history surrounding their accession to the Indian Union at the end of the 1940s, which was a major concern of Professor Achuta Rao himself. And it was a history marked by sharp differences in ambition and trajectory, and in some cases, of course, by violence and tragedy. In many ways, the passing of the princely states marked the end of an era, if it also represented the beginning of a new one. In our forthcoming deliberations, we shall doubtless be looking very closely at these events and picking over the finer points in their history, the possibilities, the probabilities, the might-have-beens of what is not really the very distant past. However, we do of course all know how these many different stories ended. They terminated in the establishment of the Indian Union and in many ways the consolidation of the Indian nation that we have down to today. So here in this keynote and at the start of our deliberations, I thought it might be useful if we stood back a bit from the tyranny of events and considered in broader and more general terms what the princely experience might be taken to mean for India's history, how it may have contributed to, or indeed distracted from, India's emergence as a modern state, how it may have shaped the subsequent development of India's society in positive or in negative ways, how significant have been the legacies of the past, or have they been swept away by a tide of futuristic modernity? In effect, where might princely India, and especially the princely India of the southern states, be thought to stand in our still evolving historiography and understanding of the Indian nation? And I must confess that I can think of very few areas of India's historiography where scholarly views have been subject to more dramatic change over the last 20 or 30 years than those concerning understandings of the princely states, and especially in southern India. At the time of independence, they were widely seen, especially by a triumphant Indian nationalism, as at best an irrelevance to the future, and at worst an obstacle to it, to be removed if necessary by force. The Maharajas, we were told, represented feudal relics, preserved through their collaboration with the colonial powers, who had no real place in modern India, certainly as princes, and after 1970, even as pensioners of the state. They and their realms were taken to have contributed very little of value, and their kingdoms were unceremoniously dissolved, with historic borders shifted to make way for a new configuration of provinces based not on royal, but on popular or demotic principles, particularly of language. Nehruvian India, Congress India, in its first two avatars, Jawaharlal and Indira, had little time for the princely past. Since the 1980s, however, perceptions and judgments have moved in a very different direction. As dreams of a facile transition to post-colonial plenitude, equality and secularism began to fade, I started to turn back to the sources in the past that made these things possible, or at least dreamable in the first place, where modern economics, social reform, cultural cosmopolitan had come together and entered the Indian scene as potential projects for a better future. And it wasn't very long before historians started to find those sources not, or at least not just, in British India and the struggle for India's freedom from colonial rule, but also in some at least of the princely states, especially those in southern India, Mysore, Travancore, Hyderabad, Cochin, Coorg, and also one or two in the west, especially Baroda, which of course had very strong southern connections. Here it was noted that from the later 19th century, experiments began to take place involving state intervention in the economy to generate modern industries, which had few correlates across the borders in British India. Mining and metal industries, electricity industries, science-based manufacturing industries in Mysore, the multitasking coir and plantation industries of Travancore, and so on. It was also noted that significant social reform programs were instituted offering improvements in health and education and opportunity to the lower castes and classes, especially in Travancore, but also in Mysore and even in Hyderabad, where some administrators sought to build special bonds between a Muslim minority and a Dalit minority across that divide. Hyderabad, too, could lay claim to a special kind of cosmopolitanism, or at least pluralism, which offered to overcome the differences of religion and ethnic background. Its so-called Deccan or Deccani synthesis, combining northern and southern Muslims, Parsis, Christians, and Hindu-landed aristocrats in a court culture focused on the Nizam's palace and city of Hyderabad. Travancore, with its elites of Syrian Christians, Tamil Brahmins, and Malayali Naya gentry, and Mysore, with its elites of Kannada, Telugu, and Tamil Brahmins, Muslim commercial classes, and Urs aristocrats, also had claims to sustaining their own cultural syntheses. Moreover, and importantly, these various projects and constructs could largely be attributed to the initiative of Indians themselves, not their erstwhile colonial rulers. The sphere of autonomy allowed by British India to princely rulers was indeed heavily circumscribed, and wherever the latter came close to crossing it, they were likely to have their fingers rapped by Calcutta and later Delhi. But some sphere of autonomy there undoubtedly was, and within that it was largely Indian actors making their own decisions about industrial investment, social reform, communal relations, who advanced these causes. In effect, these causes can be seen to have represented experiments with a distinctively Indian form of modernity, which, long after the era of the princely states itself may have passed, have continued patterning development in original ways. Mysore modern, as Janaki Nair has called it, Muslim modern, as Eric Beverley has called it, a Brahminical model of modernity, as Bjorn Hetner once proposed for Mysore. Indeed, Hetner's last point has been picked up and expanded in a number of perhaps less scholarly works of late, where the upper caste Hindu character of many of the principal actors, especially Brahmin Diwans at the courts of Mysore and Travancore, have been taken to provide an historical and cultural link between past and present, suggesting a distinctively Hindu modernity, which arose at least as much out of its religious moorings in the princely states as out of the appropriation and use of alien knowledges in colonial India. Princely India here stands as the true historical progenitor of a modern Hindu India. What went on in British India was just an unfortunate and foreign deviation. And from there we now find some historians wondering not only whether the accession of the princely states to the Indian Union at the end of the 1940s was necessary and justifiable, but whether India didn't actually lose something valuable as a result of it. If not with regard to Mysore and Travancore's Hindu modern, then with regard to Hyderabad's Muslim modern, Eric Beverley has implied an alternative by implication more satisfactory, as a trajectory into the second half of the 20th century, an alternative of Hyderabadi autonomy independence that was somehow cut off when the Nizam was frog-marched off his throne by the Indian army. Did the societies of the subcontinent then lose out when princely India was displaced by a unitary and republican nation-state? But again, was princely India entirely lost and displaced? Have all traces of it entirely been eradicated from the post-colonial present? Those following the recent liberation struggle for Telangana state must have been struck by the parallels with the old Hyderabad state, the recreation of that alliance between an Islamicate city and a surrounding countryside that formed at least one of the core pillars on which 200 years of Nizam rule rested. Elsewhere, links have been noted between the Mysore Raj and Kannadiga ethnicity, with the former sometimes used as a symbol for the latter, and between the Travancore Raj and Malayali identity. Sentiment here may have survived even the most violent of political interruptions. Indeed, is post-modern India, if I can call the present time that, now starting to turn back towards its princely past, with regard at least to cultural geography, if not necessarily politics. So then the princely states of southern India have come a very long way in historical understanding and imagination since their physical existence was so abruptly interrupted at the end of the 1940s. From villains, they have become almost heroes of India's modern history. Well, over the next couple of days, we shall be looking closely at the circumstances of their termination. So here I want to use the occasion to stand back a bit and consider, as soberly and dispassionately as one can, what may have been lost or gained by it, and by the absorption of these princely realms into the Indian Union and nation. What historically the era of the Indian princes might be taken to mean. And to begin perhaps with the issue of colonialism, I think that we may need to be fairly circumspect about how far we attribute qualities of alterity, of otherness, to these states, and conceive them as autonomous from the processes of colonial domination so evident in the rest of British India. Most of the southern states, after all, were really little older than the rise of colonialism itself, and some in effect younger. The Nizamate of Hyderabad and the Kingdom of Travancore arose out of the ambitions of the Subadar of the Mughal Empire's Hyderabad province, Nizam-ul-Mulk, and the chieftain of the Vinod princedom, Matandavarma, respectively, in the first third of the 18th century. They were part of that very political process of Mughal imperial disintegration and regional successor state construction that would eventually give suzerainty over the south to the English East India Company, from its capital at Fort St. George. And they would survive politically into the 19th century, largely through the good fortune of having been allies of the company during its final campaign against Tipu Sultan. Wadi and Mysore, of course, claimed to be much older, heading back to the Yadava Empire of the 14th century, and it would spend a great deal of time and money from the later 19th century evoking, if not necessarily proving, that claim. However, the dynasty had been defeated and displaced by Hyder Ali in 1761. It was restored only after that epochal defeat of Tipu Sultan by the East India Company in 1799. And then, of course, it was at least temporarily displaced or sidelined for a further half-century between 1831 and 1881, when it was under direct colonial administration. As that period of direct colonial administration implies, in the 19th century, these states were carefully watched and monitored by the colonial superpower, and risked punishment and even dissolution if they strayed too far from prescribed lines. Although, on the other hand, this monitoring also meant that ruling houses could count on British support to keep them on their thrones, even if their own subjects rebelled against them. In effect, if not colonial creations, they were at the very least parts of a political system ultimately sustained by colonial power. Also, many of the forces affecting their societies through this period, and giving them major political problems, were shared with, and in many cases originated from, neighbouring British India. The strong social reform measures expanding opportunities for the lower castes via health and education support that Travancore came to take, for example, can hardly be dissociated from the pressure which Christian missionaries were exercising on its caste system, stirring mobilisation and revolt among the lower castes. Without that external stimulus, it's not at all clear that the Travancore Raj would necessarily have reacted as it did. Equally, it was surely exposure to colonial capitalism, both its exploitation but also the opportunities that it created via access to new technologies and markets, that spurred the Mysore Raj into its own experiments with industrialisation, which mirrored domestically what mainly private British companies were doing elsewhere. And again, the forces of Hindu revivalism, especially via the Arya Samaj, which put the Nizam's government under growing pressure from the turn of the 20th century, were obviously forged outside, in British India, and from the encounter with missionary Christianity. Indeed, the demands for internal political reform, which would eventually set all three states, eventually see all three states introducing, albeit very limited, forms of representative government, no less obviously reflected at second hand the ruling claims of a nationalist public, which was largely formed in the centres of British rule. Princely India, particularly here in the south, was then unmistakably part of the colonial world, and representations of it as somehow outside and independent of representing an alternative and fundamentally different political universe seemed to me to be rather fanciful. But at the same time, in a number of quite important ways, the princely states did not necessarily represent precisely the same colonial world as British India itself. There were nuances, spaces, and opportunities to create variations on the theme, some of which could prove highly consequential. For example, I am persuaded that there was a greater degree of cosmopolitanism and cultural pluralism, if not necessarily secularism, in the elite cadres of princely society than across the road in British India. This started, of course, with the issue of race. Put simply, the racial and the class hierarchies of princely society were less closely aligned. There were more gaps between them, if one likes. White society was very thin, with only a very few godlike administrators and wealthy businessmen, and with very many more Indians, or natives as they would probably have been called at the time, in the upper echelons. White racial compartmentalisation was simply much less possible. Not that there was still not a degree of racism. Famously, the great Mysore Diwan Viveshwaraya left his previous employment in the Nizam's administration because he was offered less salary for the same engineering post as a white colleague. But the scale of racism was far more limited, and as Viveshwaraya's case illustrated, Europeans might also be found in the inferior role of employee in the princely states, subordinate to native rulers and businessmen. Indeed, all southern states have significant communities of poor whites as well. Race counted for less here, opening up possibilities of a multiracialism which was far more difficult to contemplate over the border in British India. Also, the political strategies of these ruling houses encouraged a greater cultural pluralism. As to some degree parvenus or restorees, all the ruling houses didn't necessarily sit very securely on their thrones. The Wadia house in Mysore faced potential rivalry among the Urs aristocratic lineages whence it had arisen. Travancore represented simply the Vinod branch of a wider Naya gentry, whose claims to supremacy over the other branches were circumstantial. The Nizams were rebels against the Mughal supremacy, with no more natural legitimacy than any other rebel. To secure themselves, all three needed to look beyond the immediate circle of their local elites, when challenges might arise, and to recruit from outside, drawing in allies from groups whose natal origins and cultural dispositions ill-suited them to launch any claims to the throne for themselves. Travancore famously drew on Syrian Christians, Tamil Brahmins, and Nambudiri Brahmins without pretensions beyond religion, to supply it with its key personnel of state. Hyderabad looked to the wider world of Islam and Mughlai Persian culture in North India, as well as cultural minorities such as Parsis and Christians, to balance its dependence on local Mulki Islamicate groups. Mysore could draw on Kannada, Tamil and Telugu Brahmins, as well as Muslim merchant groups and Urs aristocratic lineages, to create balance between the segments of its elite. All this would contrast very strongly with British Madras, where beneath the veneer of white supremacism, Tamil Brahmins came to take over practically all branches of the state in the later 19th century, displacing Maratha Brahmins who had held them before. Now, of course, this princely cosmopolitanism rested on very elitist premises. It was open only to a charmed circle of highly educated or wealthy families who could participate in its courtly cultures. And it came to be assailed by the populist socio-cultural forces arising at the time, especially from the early 20th century. Also, deep internal divisions could exist within it. The Mulki-non-Mulki split in Hyderabad between locals and outsiders became seriously embittered, at times crippling the Nizam's government. And Tamil Brahmins in Travancore could become the objects of a nascent Malayali nationalism. Excluded groups everywhere, describing themselves as depressed classes in Travancore, non-Brahmins in Mysore, Hindus in Hyderabad, made their growing dissatisfactions felt. This was never an easy cosmopolitanism without challenge from below or from more nativist premises of identity. But the princely context did represent a kind of alternative social order to the deeply racially and communally divided society that was becoming increasingly entrenched in British India. And of course it attracted a number of Indian intellectuals to its possibilities, not least among them Jawaharlal Nehru, who confessed himself entranced by the idea of the Deccani cultural synthesis, even though he would eventually preside over its political destruction, or at least he would hand over governance of it to the proto-Hindu nationalists Vallabhai Patel and K.M. Munshi, which amounted to the same thing. A second area where there may be a case for princely difference from the adjacent colonial world concerns scientific, technological and industrial modernity. Famously, from the later 19th century, Mysore and to an extent Hyderabad began to develop state policies building advanced forms of infrastructure, setting up state-backed heavy industries and promoting scientific forms of education, where, for example, Mysore and Hyderabad became sites of new universities, and Bangalore the home of the Tata-sponsored National Institute of Science. Promoting these endeavours was a series of progressive administrators, Diwans, who brought state planning to new levels for the time in India, and ultimately were to contribute strongly to early forms of industrial planning in the Indian Republic after its independence. And all this, of course, contrasted quite strongly with industrial and scientific development on the colonial side of the fence, which was attenuated and anyway relied more on private initiatives rather than state planning and direction. It is in this regard particularly that states like Mysore have been seen as cradles of Indian modernity. Now, set against that, it is undoubtedly true that the scale and significance of these endeavours could easily be exaggerated. They were penned in by colonial restrictions and limited to a handful of industries. Bjorn Hettner and Janaki Nair have both argued that what was more significant about Mysore's industrial modernity was the frustration of its ambitions rather than the scale of its achievements. Much more could have been done had colonial authorities not moved to stop it. Also, what did develop cannot wholly be separated from and juxtaposed to the wider colonial economic context. Much that did take place had the backing of or was sanctioned by the colonial power, which, at least after 1919, had its own industrial strategy for India's modernisation, where recognition of the rise of nationalist opposition brought a new emphasis on the virtues of colonial development. Also, the very presence of these modernising Diwans at the heart of princely administration itself reflected a peculiar contradiction in the colonial education and recruitment systems. After initially encouraging Indian colonial subjects into Western education, and even the Indian civil service in the middle of the 19th century, the colonial state then began to fear the consequences as very well-educated Indians began to appear later on and to challenge the European monopoly of higher government employment. A white curtain came down in British India, limiting the rise of Indian talent to the top echelons of the colonial state. But to ease these tensions, a series of very able state administrators were then siphoned off to leading positions, many as Diwans, in the princely states, supposedly where it was thought they could do no harm to imperial prestige. But of course, in effect they did, or at least they began to show up the lethargy and lack of ambition of their European colleagues in British India. Albeit circumscribed, the major princely states did allow a greater sphere of autonomy and freedom for initiative than government officials were likely to find in the more massive and internally conflicted colonial bureaucracy. They took the opportunity to press ahead with schemes of educational and economic improvement that likely would have been stifled at birth in British India. What drove many of them too might be described as a spirit of anti-colonial, if less certainly nationalist, protest, whereby they tried to show that, given the opportunity, Indians have the skill and the talents to modernise economies and societies at least as effectively as colonising Europeans, who generally denied them precisely that opportunity. They challenged colonialism's white ceiling on government and the professions. The situation set up a kind of competitive modernisation drive between princely and British India over who really was leading the process of modern development, which both sides thought desirable and a justification for their continuing rule. And this, I think, was important in at least two ways beyond the immediate context of the princely states and beyond their own political lifetimes. First, it provided India, after independence, with a pool of talent and skill to advance technical and industrial modernisation very quickly. In many ways, India's greatest infrastructural and industrial achievements were made in the 1950s, very early on in the independence period, when basic electrification was laid down and very significant irrigation and road construction works took place. The statistics on infrastructure development in those years are quite staggering, at least in comparison to anything that's followed on later. And this may have been possible precisely because India did have a pool of experienced talent to draw on domestically, so that, unlike so many other developing economies, it didn't have to rely so much on foreign technology and skilled labour. And a key source of some of that skilled labour was the more progressive princely states, which had built up a background of experience in development prior to 1947, where, for example, Bangalore was, after all, India's second industrial city after only Calcutta at the time of independence. And second, the situation also overcame a potential pitfall in India's tryst with modernity. Most of these leading Diwans and early scientists and technologists were Brahmins. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, Hetner described their activities in Mysore specifically as representing an alternative Brahminical model of modernization. By that, I think he meant a top-down model of authority which put technical proficiency before popular participation or even consent. Brahmin knowledge, whether spiritual or technocratic, has rarely sought lower caste approval. But it was also Brahminical in another sense. It combined the practice of science with respect for religion. And even more, several of these modernizing Diwans were pious Hindus and used their rising wealth, both personal and via the state, to sustain the endowment of temples and the gods. What that model signalled was an easy accommodation of Hindu religious belief to scientific endeavour, and the possibilities of an epistemic path to modernity that didn't fundamentally rupture, even if it may sometimes have bent, core cultural traditions. In many other cultures, of course, if you look around the world, the pursuit of scientific modernity has ripped apart socio-cultural fabrics, promoting dissonance and or revolution. China had to abandon its Confucian worldview to admit the possibilities of Western science. In Islam, the issue still remains highly controversial. But, and very importantly, the Brahminical accommodation helped save India from that fate and open the way to accepting scientific research and knowledge within a continuing structure of Hindu religious belief. Now, behind that accommodation, there was, of course, a great deal more and a great deal longer history that I don't have time to consider here. And it was, of course, a history stretching back across the border into colonial India, not least to the grounds of the Theosophical Society in Madras City, which was hugely influential in achieving it, and perhaps even more, making scientific endeavour appear the path to true religious understanding. Theosophy sought to apply scientific method to the revelation of religious truth. The influence of Theosophy spread rapidly into elite sections in princely society too, adding to its cosmopolitanism, and affected a number of leading Diwans. Moreover, and although still very limited, the greater sphere of autonomous public action allowed the princely state governments, permitted that accommodation to be demonstrated more clearly and more effectively and on a grander scale than in most of British India, for pious Hindu scientists to display both their arts and their crafts in significant public endeavours. It set a model of the relationship between religion, science and technical modernity, what Gyan Prakash has termed the model of another reason, that was to become much more widespread in national India subsequently. And third, a related area where positive claims for princely difference can be made concerns social reform. Famously, the Travancore Raj, from even the middle of the 19th century, passed a series of laws opening up education and public space and employment to members of the lowest castes, and began to tackle issues of gender discrimination. Less dramatically, the same was true of Mysore, especially with regard to gender, but also with regard to non-Brahmins and the incorporation of sub-elite, if not exactly lowest caste groups, more fully into the state. Hyderabad, at least in its final days, even crossed that divide with an explicit appeal to forming a bond between minorities, Dalits and Muslims, to keep out Hindu hegemony. In comparison to British India, many laws and practices in princely India, or at least Travancore, Mysore, and one would include here Baroda, appeared enlightened and progressive. Again, a deliberate point of contrast with the claims of colonialism to lead modernity. Once again, I think we may need to be a bit circumspect about princely difference and radicalism. These issues, of course, of gender and caste arose no less in colonial India and frequently originated there, especially prompted by missionary Christianity. Indeed, it was frequently missionaries from British India who precipitated crises in the princely states leading to reform, as in Travancore, where the government's reforms were far behind the curve created not only by missionary protests, but by the challenge of low-caste groups themselves, especially the SNDP Yogam of the Ejavas. While much was certainly owed to the initiatives of the mid-19th century and missionary-educated Travancore Diwans like T. Madhava Rao, ongoing reform always had the character of responding to pressures from below and moving forward only when the alternative was wreckage of the state. Travancore, for example, did legislate to open its temples to lower castes, but only in 1938, 15 years after the famous Vaikom Satyagraha, which it had resisted for as long as it could, and even arrested leaders more radical than Gandhi, such as Periyar, E.V. Ramaswamy. Also, its licensing of gender reform with regard to matrilineal tenure systems also responded to, rather than led, opinion in several key social groups, and also served the interests of male patriarchy rather more clearly than it did those of female emancipation. Similarly, in Mysore, the state tended to follow rather than initiate reform pressures building up in society. For example, responding to the rise of the Justice Party in Madras by creating quotas for non-Brahmins in education and public service. Its reactions also tended to be quite self-serving. For example, non-Brahminism enabled the ruling house to outflank dependence on Brahmin Diwans and Urs aristocrats, and to create ties with broader landowning groups, as Iyer Ikegami has shown. Moreover, its social reforms were fairly conservative, whereas Janaki Nair has shown, with regard to Devadasi, the Mysore state's efforts to emancipate women also did not challenge, but in fact reinforce, the overriding authority of male patriarchy. States like Mysore and Travancore may have been ahead of British India in actually passing reform legislation, but they were far behind radical Indian opinion in many other regards. The Mysore state, for example, remained highly suspicious of the self-respect movement and of radical Dravidianism. Nonetheless, and again, in historical context, I don't think that we should entirely write off these positions, nor regard their long-term outcomes as necessarily inconsequential. The spheres of autonomy permitted in the princely states, though very limited, were wide enough for issues of social reform to be taken up in government circles and debated more rigorously and with greater hope of effecting change than across the border in British India. After 1857, of course, the British pledged religious neutrality and to eschew social reform, which, since they controlled the legislative power, meant that they also blocked all but the most residual channels by which Indian society could reform and change itself. Some issues, like the age of consent, broke through, but only in the face of massive resistance from the colonial power. This partly changed after 1920, when the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms created the possibility that British India was on the way to governing itself, and hence might be allowed to address these matters that were of concern to it, such as marriage and family law. But still, the colonial camp was tight, and Delhi was nervous of permitting any reform that stirred controversy. But here again, the princely states, with their own longer-standing traditions of participation in their own self-government, were always allowed a greater sphere of freedom for talk and action, to discuss the possibilities of reform and to some extent to realise them. The actions of princely government could be characterised as native or indigenous and remove the colonial power from responsibility if things went wrong, although care was usually taken through close surveillance that they never went so far as approaching going wrong. In this sense, many of the social reform debates that really exploded into Indian national politics in the interwar years, in the 20s and 30s, already had some precedence in the southern princely states. The issues taken up for debate and less certainly action somewhat earlier. Princely India again could set precedents for British India, which indeed national India would later take up and develop itself. As a symbol of this position, one might note that the first public birth control clinic in the subcontinent was set up in Mysore rather than in British India, and in 1930, while the matter was still wildly controversial. And another of the precedents set by princely India also turned out to be highly consequential, or at least influential in the longer term. This was the imperative to reform and remodel modern Indian society, basically within the institutional structures supplied by its received traditions, such as caste, religion and patriarchy, rather than outside in opposition to them. That imperative has in fact been so dominant over the way that India has come to reform and remodel itself that it's hard to think that there was ever any alternative. And at least if one follows Nick Dirks and Bernard Cohn, even colonial rule itself can be seen to have supported the imperative, rigidifying, if not exactly inventing, caste at the base of colonial modernity. But at least notionally, it's also possible to identify alternatives at the time with goals far more radical, which might have taken India towards different conclusions. Moreover, many of these alternatives were no less parts of the congerie of Western ideas that we associate with colonialism. Evangelical Protestant missionaries, for example, abhorred the institution of caste and set about explicitly undermining it, trying to create a caste-less society. Radical secularists, including before her conversion to Theosophy Annie Besant, abhorred religion and wanted to sweep it away from the public stage. And for a time, the celebrated British atheist Charles Bradlaugh had a very strong following in South India. Later on, communism too found several constituencies in the south. Its Telugu sponsors, including the remarkable N.G. Ranga, its Tamil sponsors were international, including the émigré Philip Spratt. Within South Indian culture itself too, there were deep traditions of revolt against the hierarchies of caste, as well as the practices of worshipping gods at odds with those of the Sanskritic pantheon. And in modern times it was the South too that generated perhaps the most genuinely radical cultural and political movement anywhere in colonial India, arguably at the time anywhere in the world, the atheist, anti-caste, pro-feminist, self-respect and radical Dravidian movement of E.V. Ramaswamy. Now, there are no doubt many reasons why these more radical impulses eventually failed to realise themselves very fully in the South, and why reform came to accommodate itself to and sustain caste and religion. Eventually, as many commentators like Marguerite Barnett have noted, even radical Dravidianism would compromise itself, with Annadurai watering down many of E.V. Ramaswamy's prescriptions as the DMK became increasingly political in the 1950s and 60s. But among the reasons for this deepening conservatism may have been the distinctive role of the princely states in the coming of social modernity. Put simply, their ruling houses' own claims to legitimacy, especially in relation to rival houses and lineages, depended critically on the ideology of caste Hinduism. To establish their own claims, the dynasties in Travancore and Mysore, the ruling houses, demanded a Kshatriya status that would distinguish them from their other lineages, and which they buttressed with religious ceremonials and lavish patronage to Brahminical and temple sources. As kings, they could of course legitimately practice Rajadharma. They could alter the positions of the caste within the caste hierarchy. They could reform within caste. But what they could never contemplate was abolishing caste and Brahmanism altogether without putting their own kingship at risk. In the princely context, then, social reform may very well have been sponsored and developed, in practice even ahead of British India. But in some ways, more important was the kind of reform it was within the received structures of religious culture. If never decisive, this I think can be seen to have contributed to the social conservatism of modernity in South India, to that paradox noted long ago by Suzanne and Lloyd Rudolph, that in South India modernity so very often seems an extension rather than an abrogation of tradition. And finally, there is the question of the princely state's contribution to the long struggle against colonialism and for the freedom of the Indian nation. On the surface, of course, this contribution may not look very great, since at least Travancore and Hyderabad tried to opt out of that nation at independence, and what shape any freedom ought to take among the princely states was always a controversial matter. Mysore may have been ahead of the rest in granting political representation to some of its subjects, and even hinting at a future of constitutional monarchy, but it showed marked reluctance in defining the details, while Travancore and Hyderabad resisted the logic of democracy as much and sometimes as violently as they could. Indeed, in Travancore, the case produced one of the supreme ironies of modern Indian history. For C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, the last great Diwan of Travancore, who brutally suppressed political protest and made a final stand for princely independence in 1947, was of course the same man who, 30 years earlier, during the First World War, had been a leading proponent of the Home Rule League and had practiced passive resistance himself against the British Raj. C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer's reverse political career, from Indian nationalism to die-hard defender of princely prerogative, illustrates, I think, nicely the complexities raised by the national question in South India. Yet if the shape and the structure of any new nation, or nations, in India was never very clear in princely imagination, the spirit of anti-colonialism very much was. As we've seen, the princely states' contradictory position in relation to British rule enjoined a degree of antipathy and competitiveness against Calcutta Delhi, expressed as much through economic and social reform as anything else. Princely regimes chased against the limits of their autonomy and sought to use it to prove their superior capacities for ruling and developing the societies of their kingdoms. And betimes that could spill over into more overt forms of anti-colonial resistance, where at least Baroda and Cochin were frequently thought to be in league with and encouraging Indian political nationalism. And of course there were deep suspicions that the Hyderabad Raj was a haven for pan-Islamists, Khilafatists and other proponents of a Muslim world freed of European rule. Yet the scope for such activities was heavily circumscribed, and post-1857 the risk of going too far down the line of political resistance was likely to be loss of a kingdom. Where princely rule, I think, may have had a greater say over the political direction of India was not perhaps in 1947, when the Second World War and its aftermath in the resurgence of mass Indian nationalism offered few alternatives beyond that which eventuated. Rather, it might be seen to have been in the 1930s, when schemes for an Indian federation were afoot, which envisioned the princes joining a greater Indian dominion, if not quite nation, on what would have been for them much more favourable terms in which they would have kept some part of their sovereignty. Of course, the reluctance of many of the princes to consider that possibility doomed the plan to unfulfilment, and showed a great nervousness among them at participating in any kind of subcontinental project which might undermine their individual autonomy. Some commentators have considered that this was the princes' great mistake, opting out of a federal India in the 1930s and in the end putting themselves as a result irrevocably against a mass Indian nation in the 1940s in a struggle that could only end in one way. Yet, of course, one does have to ask, was the federation practical politics, even in the 1930s? Had the princes taken it up, would India have looked very different? In many ways, looking at it now, one has to say it seems something of a feudal fantasy of the British to preserve their own influence over South Asia, which was already fast diminishing. Historians no doubt love to indulge in counterfactual possibilities and the what might have beens and ifs of history. But if one thinks about it, for India to have come to self-rule in 1947 on the basis of a constitutional structure really dominated by the Maharajas, which was what federation implied, one suspects that the entire history of the world in the later 20th century would have to have been different. I mean, no Second World War, because that undermined the British Empire in which this unlikely dominion-esque structure would have been lodged. No prior depression to undermine Britain's leading place in a global economy, an economy which sustained these wider imperial and post-imperial structures. No First World War to set up the circumstances for the depression late on and so on. Really to see the federal structure of the late 1930s surviving into the modern world, I think one has to make counterfactual propositions of such an extraordinary degree that perhaps the endeavour is best abandoned. Federation in 1937, even if had it been taken on, would very unlikely have survived the Second World War and the events that led on eventually to India's mass independence as a republican nation state. Any alternative was something the British loved, but has very little justification. And so we reach 1947. Over the next 2 days, I think we shall be hearing a series of papers on the circumstances of the accession and the various consequences of the princely states and their societies. And various they were, from smooth transition in Mysore to bloodshed, years of warfare, and a suppressed revolution in Hyderabad. Doubtless matters could have been managed better, and what happened in Hyderabad must remain something of a blot on the record of the new India. Indeed, in the most recent historiography, it appears almost a contradiction of the avowed goals of that new India, especially with regard to secularism and pluralism. Hyderabad became a theatre in which Hindu nationalism and ethnic chauvinism triumphed over a Deccani synthesis, which actually had exhibited clearer pluralist and secularist qualities. But in the end, all these princely states and societies were absorbed into a national India, standing on principles of equality, universality, and homogeneity, notionally inimical to them. Princely India passed into the history books and out of India's modern future. But again, to leave you with a thought, really did it? As I hope these brief remarks have suggested, many of the experiences of the princely past prove far from irrelevant to building India's national future. Its cosmopolitanism, scientific and technical modernism, and social reformism, the legacies of the princely past can be seen to have continued informing the present. The cultural distinctiveness of Bangalore today, for example, I think can hardly be separated from its inheritances from the old Mysore Raj. It's not just a product of the new economic forces moving India over the last few decades. For some commentators, no doubt, these inheritances by no means appear entirely progressive. By their very nature, these regimes preserved or conserved caste and religion, and used them as socio-cultural tools to shape a particular kind of future and modernity. They cast Indian social reform in a very conservative mould. But for other commentators, of course, this would mark a very major and positive achievement, since it has enabled India to reform and modernise itself without tearing up the fabric of its society. I leave judgment on that debate to you. But that there is debate, and increasingly so as views of the princely past come back into historical vision, seems to me a very valuable feature of our current historiography, which I'm sure will be further enriched by the papers we shall hear over the next 2 days. Thank you very much for listening to me.